Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. As we prepare to begin our program, we would ask everyone to check that cell phones have been turned off as a great courtesy to those recording the program, as well, of course, to our presenters. We will post the program within 24 hours on our homepage for everyone's future reference, and of course, we are very happy that the U.S. Institute of Peace is joining us in co-hosting this program this afternoon. Welcoming on behalf of my colleagues here at Heritage is our Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, Phil Trueluck. Phil?
Thank you, John. Welcome everybody. We're delighted to have you here. I'm glad John always says turn your cell phones off, because I'm usually the one that doesn't, and that's the one time it rings is when I'm up here. It just happens all the time. But welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Delighted to have all of you here. And we're delighted particularly to be co-sponsoring this session with the United States Institute of Peace. We've been talking for a number of years to try to come up with some programs we could jointly do, and I think this is an excellent one to start off on. Both of our organizations clearly understand the importance it is that the gains of the Afghan women that have been made over the last decade or so are not lost as the U.S. and coalition forces draw down. Through U.S. engagement, training, and assistance, Afghan girls have had greater access to education and health care, and Afghan women are more involved in the political and economic life of the country they have been in for a long time. Maintaining this momentum for women will help encourage stability and prosperity in the country and ultimately make it less of a target for terrorists. There are tremendous fear among Afghans that as international forces depart, the Taliban will regain influence in the country and use the same tactics against women that they have done in the past. We must do everything possible to help prevent this. That is our purpose to start this conversation today. This is important from a human rights perspective and is critical to U.S. national security as well. The status of women in Afghan society will determine whether Afghan will once again become a hotbed of terrorism. Today's program is the first in what we hope will be a series of events that we'll co-host with the United States Institute of Peace. As Jim Marshall and I were just talking, it's one of the few government programs government funding programs we actually support, and we will lobby on your behalf because it's a great use of funds. I believe that our two institutions working together on this issue sends a very powerful message about America's commitment to the women in Afghanistan. And to continue the program, let me introduce the President of the United States Institute of Peace, Jim Marshall. All of you probably know him from his former incarnation. Before joining the Institute, he represented the 3rd and then the 8th districts of Georgia in the U.S. House of Representatives. He also served as mayor of Macon, Georgia in the 1990s. And he is a decorated veteran of Vietnam War and has been inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame. He is a graduate of Princeton and holds a law degree from Boston University. He has also taught at Princeton and Mercer University. I'm going to turn the program over to Jim, and he's going to introduce our speakers, and then there will be a panel discussion after that. And again, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jim Marshall.
Thank you, Phil, for those kind words. And we do look forward to working with you and the Heritage Foundation over the years in different ways. I want to compliment Lisa Curtis in particular. I don't know where she is here in the room, but she's been great putting this together, and we really appreciate all the work that she's done. Jim Carafano was also instrumental in helping with this, and appreciate that as well. I won't repeat, but simply second what Phil has already said about the progress that's been made by Afghan women and how we really don't want that to slip as a result of the transition that's about to occur. What I'll share with you are two things. First, I have made many trips to Afghanistan as a member of Congress. My first trip to Afghanistan, not as a member of Congress, occurred in September. Andrew Wilder, who will be one of the panelists, was my principal host. I was looking at our Afghan programs, And he had a very organized trip where I was getting together with one group after another, after another, after another. And with the first group, which was a bunch of tribal elders, it occurred to me to ask them to individually think about what is the single most important thing that an individual actor, be it a country or an individual or a party or what have you, could do to assure, or at least get closest to assuring, that there will be success for Afghanistan. So that was the question. And I asked them all not to listen to what the first person says and then change their mind. Now, who knows whether they obeyed. So the tribal leaders, almost all, said that the upcoming political transition was critically important. I did the same thing with a bunch of mostly Kabul-based, pretty elite men, wealthy, business, politics, etc., very educated, very impressive people. And it was individually unanimous, the upcoming political transition. And then I got together with a similar group of Afghan women for dinner. They were almost all Kabul-based. They were civil society individuals, educators, politicians, very impressive people. Asked the same question. And there were 2 of the 7 that talked about something else. But 5 of the 7 came out and said, if we don't get this political transition right, the country's going to disintegrate into civil war, and all the gains we've made will be lost. So the political transition that's coming up is the one thing that's terribly important to us. And once they started talking about it, the 2 that had suggested some specific things with regard to the rights of women backed off and said, no, you guys are right. What's looming is what's most important. So that's just one observation. The second, I'll just mention one part of an op-ed on the subject of the political transition that I published in Foreign Policy recently. And it was just this observation. Here in the United States, when we're focused on the transition in Afghanistan, what do we think about? What do we talk about? We talk about troop levels, right? That's principally what the discussion is. It's troop levels. And you hear figures that range from, say, roughly 6,000, 8,400, to 20,000 to the Kagans think that it needs to be 60,000, something like that. Well, it ain't going to be 60,000. We all know that. It's going to be somewhere between probably 8.4 and 20, hopefully closer to the 20 from my perspective. And when we talk about that, what we're talking about for each 1,000 troops, at least by United States costs, more than $1 billion a year. More than $1 billion a year for every 1,000 soldiers. Significantly more than $1 billion a year. We also chatter a little bit about talking with the Taliban. It's fine to talk and build relations and stuff like that, but nothing's going to happen before the Taliban see what happens with the political transition. They're not going to be so foolish as to cut a deal at this point when they have the prospects of a much better deal if the political transition goes badly. So I described it as chattering in Washington about that question. I got called out for saying chattering, and I said, that's what it is, it's chattering. Nothing's going to happen on that subject. What do? We've been quibbling about the resources that we would put into getting the political transition correct. The Independent Election Commission and the United Nations came up with a plan that was going to cost $100 million. And we balked at that. What are we thinking? $100 million when the difference in the troop levels from 6,400 or whatever it is to 20,000 won't make a bit of difference in whether or not Afghanistan falls apart. If you got more troops, they're not going to be able to stop it at those levels. You got more troops, it's just going to be a bigger question of how we get them out of there or who we're going to side with in this civil war that ensues. So we got our priorities screwed up here. We should be, the amount of money that we could pour into getting the political process right is paltry compared to the sums that we're talking about when we talk about swings in troop levels. And we need to get our priorities straight, at least for the balance of the time that remains where the political transition has occurred, is concerned. And if that doesn't happen, I don't think anything else that we try to do to support women in Afghanistan will be very successful. We'll certainly struggle with all of those things. I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to run my mouth like that. Obviously something that's very important to me and to the Institute. Cathy McMorris Rodgers is a friend. We traveled together to Iraq on a Codel, got to know one another then. I'm somebody who voted a little bit to the R side, although I had a D after my name, so I got along well with both sides of the aisle. Congressman McMorris Rodgers was first elected in 2004, representing the eastern edge of the state of Washington. Now serving her 5th term, she has risen through the ranks in the House of Representatives and is currently the Republican Conference Chair, a top position in the House Representatives leadership. Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers has been involved in the bipartisan Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, serving as co-chairs from 2007 to 2008. She has been a leader on women's issues both at home and abroad. 2 years ago, following a trip to Afghanistan, she and Congresswoman Donna Edwards began the Afghan Women's Task Force. We're grateful for their bipartisan initiative and frankly for trying to keep Washington and Kabul focused on protecting women and their roles in Afghanistan and its future. And I'm just delighted that Cathy's available and able to do this today. Cathy McMorris Rodgers.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to see you at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to join you today on this important discussion, and great to see a room full of people who care about the future and the freedom of the Afghan women. It's such an important cause, and as a woman and a mom, it's a cause that is very near and dear to my heart. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation and the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting this important series. It's a dialogue that will prove invaluable in the months ahead, and I am confident that it is going to help our success as we move forward because of the leadership we're going to see today. Donna Edwards isn't here yet, but I want to thank her, my colleague, Donna Edwards, for joining me in this effort. We have joined in the effort to have the bipartisan Afghan Women's Task Force in the House, and it's to focus on the role of women in Afghanistan. We, as was mentioned, we launched it a few years ago, but we're all here today because we share the same goal: to promote the freedom of Afghan women as we continue to spread democracy and fight terrorism around the world. Maybe we're here because we've been on the ground in Afghanistan, and we've seen the potential women have as innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Maybe we're here because we believe Afghan women need more support than ever as U.S. and NATO troops begin their withdrawal. But regardless of what brought us to this place, we're all here because we care about making life better for the women of Afghanistan. We care because here in America, we witness the limitless opportunities women have every single day. And we believe deeply that every woman, no matter where she is born, should have those same opportunities. Let me tell you why I care. I care because of women like Bibi Aisha, yes, thank you, whose nose and ears were cut off. She was left to die by her husband and his family as punishment for fleeing her arranged marriage to a Taliban fighter. I care because of women like Sakina, who at 14 years old was sold into a marriage with a man who used her as an indentured servant and beat her with weaving tools every single day of her life. I care because of all the innocent women who fell victim to a terrorist regime that oppressed them, dehumanized them, and robbed them of their most basic rights. I care because of the women and girls who, under the Taliban, were forbidden from leaving their homes, weren't allowed to go to school, were beaten and killed for being seen in public. That's why we're all here, because terrorist organizations gain their power by oppressing people. And they gain their power, in this example, by oppressing women. The most basic premise of terrorism is the oppression of people. And as an American woman living in a country where a woman can be anything she wants to be, I am more compelled than ever to fight back on this oppression. Because by promoting women, their ability to start a business, go to school, to become an entrepreneur, we're taking away the terrorist ability to terrorize. The two go hand in hand. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of joining a women's congressional delegation to Afghanistan, and Donna and I were on this one together. And we were amazed and inspired by the progress we witnessed among women on the ground. During this trip, we visited a girls' school, for example. And at this girls' school, we met 12th graders and asked them, so what do you hope to be upon graduation? And they answered, doctor, teacher, attorney. And we reflected on the fact that just a few years ago, they didn't have those kind of dreams. You would have asked them the same question, and they weren't even dreaming those kind of dreams. They didn't have those dreams because they didn't think that they had the potential to reach them. Instead, they were systematically oppressed by a terrorist government that sought to dehumanize them. So it's no coincidence that the decline of the Taliban and the American influence in the region has benefited the Afghan people, and especially women. Before September 11th, 2001, girls couldn't go to school. Women were forced to wear the burqa. It was unheard of for women to vote or hold public office. Music was banned, and soccer fields were converted into execution fields. So in the last 10 years, we've witnessed a major improvement in the lives of Afghan women. And not coincidentally, a significant decline in the influence of terrorism. We've seen the rise of organizations that are devoted solely to the promotion of women in Afghanistan, the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, and the International Institute for the Empowerment of Women. They've been instrumental in mentoring Afghan women, bringing them to the United States to learn how to become business owners. For 7 years, these organizations have brought Afghan women to the United States. And in that time, women have begun to own and operate a diverse group of businesses in Afghanistan. Soccer ball manufacturing company, internet cafes, fish farming, IT companies, bed and breakfasts, and even a mobile app company. There are women like Taj, who at 28, she had 28 women for her when she came to the United States in 2007. After she was trained by women business owners, she went back to Afghanistan and now has more than 300 employees. But despite the tremendous success of women in Afghanistan, Afghan women are still scared to death about troops leaving next year because there are still pockets of terrorist organizations all around the country. There are women like Freshta, who operates the only women-owned printing company in the country of Afghanistan. And just 2 years ago, she decided to bid on a contract against one of her male counterparts, and she won the bid. Not long after, the male contractor paid to sabotage her business and burned her entire building down. She lost everything. It's stories like these that remind me that our work is far from over. We've made incredible strides in the eradication of terrorism, but there's still a lot to be done. While many Afghan women are now teachers and business owners and members of parliament, they still leave their homes every single morning and have no idea if they're going to come back to their kids at the end of the day. They're fearful that when the troops leave, the Taliban will rise to power and oppress them once again. And so, as the troops begin their withdrawal in the year to come, we must remain more active and involved than ever. We must continue to bring Afghan women to the United States. We must continue to mentor them, and we must continue to remind them that they deserve a future that is free from fear and oppression. As former Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Faziza Kofi said, Fazia, reconciliation will not bring peace to Afghanistan. Peace is a result of democracy. And you have to include everyone in that process, including women. As we continue our fight against terrorism, I encourage all of us to remember that terrorists cannot succeed when women are empowered. So I challenge us all to do what we can to empower them. We must never forget that the success of free societies depends on the freedom of its citizens. And as Americans, as citizens of the greatest, freest nation on this earth, I'm proud of everything we've done to bring freedom to those who didn't have it before. So thank you so much for all that you're doing here for those in Afghanistan and all around the world.
Thank you, Kathy. Great words. It's my pleasure now to introduce another friend, Donna Edwards, who is a Democrat first elected in June of 2008 from the state of Maryland. She's now serving her 4th term in the House of Representatives. She is a strong voice for progressive Democrats and an equally active defender of human rights and justice around the globe. Congresswoman Edwards is a leader on gender issues as the new co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, working with McMorris Rodgers, fellow Washingtonian Republican co-chair Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, who together with Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers and other members of the Afghan Women's Caucus, Congresswoman Edwards has done a great deal to raise awareness in Washington, D.C. of the challenges facing Afghan women. She is, at least in my experience, a very entertaining speaker. And with that, Donna Edwards.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's really good to see you again, and good to see how wonderfully you've landed at the U.S. Institute for Peace. I think your leadership is incredibly important, and it's great to be here as well at the Heritage Foundation, because I think this is an important conversation for us to have across the political spectrum. And I don't know how entertaining I'll be today, but I do want to share a few things with you. And I appreciate my colleague, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, in sharing some of the experiences that we shared together and have shared together over the last couple of years with Afghan women, and the deep commitment that we both feel, but also that so many of our colleagues, particularly women members of Congress, feel in terms of our responsibility, if you will, to continue to elevate the voices and experiences of the women of Afghanistan in this important transition. And it is, of course, quite a transition. I've had the distinct honor since I've been in Congress of traveling to Afghanistan, I think 4 times now, with the specific purpose of visiting with Afghan parliamentarians and businesswomen and women and girls in schools, and even with women in prison. I think when Ms. McMorris Rodgers and I went with a couple of our colleagues on a Mother's Day trip 2 years ago, in fact, we visited a women's prison, and what was really clear there is that the only reason that these women were in prison is because they had been accused of crimes that were related to their gender. And they were there with their girls and their little boys, and they were teaching and training and doing for each other. And it was just a reminder to us of the incredible circumstance that the women of Afghanistan, and indeed women throughout the world, experience because of their gender. Over the years, I've had the honor of visiting and observing in Afghanistan and learning about the circumstances of women throughout the country. Even in this most recent visit, I think as Ms. McMorris Rodgers mentioned, that hearing from girls in a school, literally dozens and dozens of girls, and when asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And to see their hands just flying forward and talking about the future as though there were really a future for them was so tremendously rewarding. And the reason for me, and I had this experience that the first year that I visited Afghanistan, the first visit that I made, I also asked the same question in a school, in an area where the schools were just starting for girls. And not a hand went up when asked that same question. And I think that that speaks to the tremendous progress that's been made in Afghanistan among women and girls, and particularly in education. And it says that there are girls who actually do believe in a future. And part of the reason that they believe in that future is because the Afghan people have stepped up with the assistance of, obviously, of international forces, and created an environment that allows that to happen and allows that vision to take place. And so that's a good thing. Unfortunately, I think that over the last decade, and particularly since the degradation of the Taliban forces, women and girls have indeed made significant progress. Millions, as we've discussed, who've received access to education that was previously restricted. Women in civil society who've been able to speak more openly about their hopes for a peaceful Afghanistan, and to call for participation in developing and designing and participating in that peaceful Afghanistan. The international partners who've stepped forward to help create an environment to make that happen. But for all of that progress, I think that we have to all acknowledge here today that the attacks and the assassinations of women leaders in Afghanistan over the last several months really continue to highlight the ongoing challenges that are facing women in that country. The failure to ensure consideration of women in the security framework is an ongoing obstacle. And I think that to the extent that we have the ability over these next several months, helping to ensure that that participation is part of the framework going forward, will tell us whether or not there will be a truly successful model in Afghanistan for women's progress and participation. And I think overall in politics and in public life, we can certainly see the great progress of Afghan women. I was very recently on Capitol Hill. We had a photographic exhibit on display on the Hill. And I walked around that display with the ambassador's wife, and we viewed each one of these photographs, and it was really clear that some of them were photographs that measured progress over time, and we can point to that. And so there are great reasons that we have to celebrate that kind of progress, but I don't think that we should kid ourselves that the days and the months and the weeks that are ahead don't provide a tremendous challenge for Afghan women. Over the last couple of years, Representative McMorris Rodgers and I, in conjunction with our colleagues, have tried to use our time, as it were, to provide and to continue to call attention to the ways in which we face these obstacles, to call attention to President Karzai about the fact that, in fact, as women legislators, we are being very vigilant about the engagement of women in the security process, in the peace process. I think that's actually been helpful on the ground, but it's not the only thing that we can do, and we understand that. We also understand our own limitations. When we meet here in the United States with Afghan women parliamentarians who visit us, or business women, or through the many networks, some of which are represented in this room here today, it does seem clear that there are things that we can do, but we are limited in that capacity. And so I think we have viewed our role very much as making sure that we are in ongoing communication, for example, with our own State Department, following what's happening with Afghanistan in the international community, writing letters when it's appropriate and when the women of Afghanistan say this is a thing that we want them to do. I think that for all of our energy and excitement, and I know that this is true certainly for the women's advocacy community here in the United States, that our tendency is just to, move right forward. And I think long before I came into Congress, I've been an advocate for women around issues of domestic violence and in the international sector. And one of the things that I've had a difficult time, but that has been required learning, is the fact that sometimes it's the women in country who actually have to lead the design. And sometimes, a lot of times, most of the times, we have to take our guidance from them. I think that is certainly true of Afghan women. And I think the other thing that has become clear is that the vision and voice of Afghan women is not a monolith. That women in rural communities may think differently from women in Kabul, in urban communities. Well, how much different, frankly, is that from the United States? Not very much. And so I think it's really been very important for us to understand when it is that we need to take our guidance. And although, I had been troubled for some time, I think, as my colleagues have when visiting Afghanistan, and we've seen women who are in burqas and women who are uncovered. And while it may bother us, one of the most profound experiences that I had on my first visit to Afghanistan was meeting with a group of women in a relatively rural community. And women came in all different manners of dress. And then after a while, meeting with us as women legislators in that closed room, eventually the burqas came off, the scarves came off, and we sat and we talked as women. We talked about our experience of violence. We talked about our experience of childbirth. We talked about our experience of childcare and working and all of the things that women talk about. And at the end of the meeting, the women who had come covered themselves again as they went back to their communities. Well, of course, that was about their protection. And they understood that in a way that we couldn't understand it. And so it was a reminder to me, again, of the importance of not making judgments that may not be based in reality in terms of a woman's experience. And we have those things to learn as we move forward in dealing with Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future. I am incredibly proud that Congress has taken some really affirmative steps when it comes to women in Afghanistan. In fact, last December, to affirm that commitment, we included women in the security framework by passing a bipartisan amendment that was actually co-sponsored by Senator Robert Casey and then Senator Bailey Hutchinson, that promoted the security of Afghan and women and girls in the National Defense Authorization Act. This was a really important affirmative statement from all of us as members of Congress about our desire to see that would happen with respect to Afghanistan. It was an important message for us to convey as a policy message to the people, to the government, to the president of Afghanistan. But even after, so many of these achievements and discussions that have been held, we really have to contend with the reality. The fact that for all the treasure, and there has been tremendous treasure invested in Afghanistan, tremendous American treasure invested in Afghanistan, and we salute that. We also know that the gains that have been made by Afghan women and girls are potentially on the verge of being lost. Now, I know that we can't make an argument, a policy argument here in the United States, that the reason to stay in Afghanistan is about the women and girls. But what we do know is that the significant gains that have been made without vigilance and insistence will be lost. And that is our responsibility, even as we make a decision to draw down in Afghanistan. As the war winds down, Afghan women, and I think to their credit, frankly, are questioning their future, as they ought to. They're concerned that the vacuum that may be at least partially filled by the Taliban is causing them to leave work and government, and in some instances, abandoning public life altogether. This should be a concern for all of us, because I think, as former Secretary Clinton acknowledged, that the future of Afghanistan rests in the hands of the success or the failure of Afghan women and girls. I believe that, and I know that many of us here believe that as well. In fact, about 200 female reporters in Afghanistan and their news outlets voluntarily left their jobs in 2012. And I can tell you that this is a really significant problem. I remember on a trip that we made to Afghanistan with then Speaker Pelosi, and as we were being interviewed upon our departure, the room was filled with reporters, and honestly, half of the reporters in the room were women, were Afghan women. And I dare say that this latest trend, in fact, is very, very disturbing. Just last Friday in Foreign Policy magazine, an article was run that was entitled "A Shameful Neglect," and I would call your attention to it. In that article, the author pressed that we have to look squarely at our own complicity in the shameful circumstances of Afghan women. Billions of international aid dollars, and 12 years after warplanes first bombed their ill-starred land. This is a warning, I think, to all of us, that for women in many of the provinces and tribal regions, the aid dollars and the talk haven't quite matched up. We have to acknowledge that on the record and ask ourselves for the future, how will we make our talk match up to the assistance that's going into Afghanistan? Women still die with obscurely high rates of maternal mortality. Have there been improvements? Absolutely. Absolutely they have. There have been, but they're not enough. And we don't have to measure those standards necessarily by Western standards, but we must measure them by some standard and seek some answers when those standards are not being met. And including myself, I think, we have a heartfelt interest in the lives, the future, and the circumstances and the plight of the women of Afghanistan. And we have to remain not just as merely talkers, but as doers where that's concerned. And so I don't really know, and I think my colleague would share this, I don't know what all the answers are. And we may not have all of the answers, and they may be piecemeal, but it's also a long-term commitment. And so I know as a member of Congress, I'm committed to stay vigilant about that, even as we press forward with this withdrawal. And I have to say, it's important for us to be allies as legislators with Afghan women parliamentarians who are working under incredibly difficult circumstances. And it's important for us to understand the value of allying as legislators with our colleague parliamentarians in Afghanistan. And not to pass judgment over how far they choose to go, but to support them in the work that they do. And so I want to close because I think it's important for us to get to a real conversation. We've committed more than a decade, 12 years now, in Afghanistan, pursuing many goals, but among those goals, improving the lives of women and girls. We can't let up that pursuit. And so today for Afghanistan, and I know for the women of Afghanistan, it seems an uncertain future. But one thing that is certain is that for the future, an Afghanistan that even in small bits and pieces continues to improve the lives of women and girls is a far better sight than a decade ago. And the question remains for us in the Western world, how vigilant and how forceful we will be in our own legislatures in ensuring their success. And again, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention this afternoon, and I look forward to the dialogue that we're prepared to engage in now. Thank you very much.
So no evidence of entertainment in that talk, but for both of our speakers, evidence of thoughtfulness and real power. We have only a few minutes here for questioning because Cathy has to get back by 3. She's got a meeting. So maybe questions addressed to Cathy, and then Donna, you might be able to stay for a little bit longer. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. We've got a microphone headed your way. You can just sort of toss it if you want
Or
to.
my voice carries in the room pretty well.
We're going to try and get this. It's probably being. It's certainly being
I just
taped.
came back from a year as a justice advisor in Afghanistan, and I think I met you both when you were with Speaker Pelosi. Wanted to ask you to remain focused on going forward. Is it's not just the Taliban, that the conservative mindset that exists within many families will continue to be an issue for women. So please don't drop the concern for women, even if we could completely eradicate the Taliban. Thank you.
I think that's an important point, and Donna alluded to it in her comments when she was talking about the importance of allowing the Afghan women to take the lead, and that they may have different goals than what we might have for them if we just went in there and said this is what needs to happen. And when we sit down and have the conversations with the Afghan women, they have asked for mentorship in various fields, and that's why I think the work that we have done in keeping the lines of communication open between their members in the parliament and us, and we've had several different delegations that will come and we'll sit down and talk with them, or the business mentoring. I think all of that is very important. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the Afghan women to decide and how they think the best steps are moving forward. And they have asked us through the years to help give them a voice, to help to as Americans say, okay, it is important that women are represented around the table when decisions are being made, and I think there are ways that we can help partner with them or help reinforce what their requests are, and especially in this transition as we move forward, that's going to be important that we are continuing to insist that women are represented and that their voices are around the table.
Yes, ma'am. In the back.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talks and experience, and also your commitment with Afghanistan, especially for women of Afghanistan. So I know it's very clear that issues in Afghanistan would not be, the impact of issues in Afghanistan will not be limited to Afghanistan based on the previous experiences. So my question is, in the Congress, how would you unify your perspective or your intention about women's protection in Afghanistan? I believe, based on my recent experience, there are some congressmen that they don't really have that interest, and they believe that this is not U.S.'s issue anymore. So is it a difficult job to unify that perspective?
You're going to speak on behalf of the men.
I'll speak on behalf of the males in Congress. As in defense of the males in Congress, I should say, I guess. In my new role, as I travel and I argue that people should get involved, whether it's business or entities of one sort or another, in furthering peace building, one of the things they'll ask is, well, how do you do that? You know, what should we do? What's first on your priority list? And there are a number of different things, but typically the first thing I start with is educating and empowering women globally is the most significant thing that will likely lead to a more peaceful world. And I'm somebody who's on the Armed Services Committee, you know, typical jock kind of guy. And I would say, based on my opinion polls of members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, that all the men agree that there's not really any difference of opinion on that one. I don't know, you might.
I have to say, I mean, I do think that some of the challenges are, again, it's sort of the knowledge that it is true. We acknowledge, whether it's from the World Bank or the United Nations or other institutions, acknowledge that making investments in women and education is a real investment in the future. And then we have to make fiscal decisions about where to spend the money. And I do think that for too long, there have not been metrics attached to assistance that ask us the question of whether we're measuring what we're giving by the achievement of women and girls. And I think that that is a fundamental question, and it's one that we have to wrestle with in Congress, because for those who believe that and who know, and we all do, want whatever assistance dollars we give to be spent wisely and to be spent efficiently. And the fact is, it's a fiscal argument to spend those dollars wisely and efficiently when you're spending them educating women and girls. That is true in Afghanistan. Frankly, it's true in the United States.
But
Yes.
I'll just say it has been, it's been an issue that when the women travel to Afghanistan, it's true, Republican and Democratic women come back very passionate about this. And that I think because of our own personal experiences, we recognize and we know firsthand how important it is. And it's been an issue that it's been great to see, actually, the high-profile Republican and Democratic women from Hillary Clinton to Laura Bush, as well as many within Congress, that have said this has to be a priority, and that it is a key part of determining whether or not we're ultimately going to be successful. With that, Jim, I'm going to say thanks for having me, and I'm going to sneak out and leave it in your good hands.
Thank you. I can't wait for the privilege of speaking for Cathy
Oh,
We've got time for a couple more questions, and then we're going to follow immediately to the panel right here in the front.
Thank you, Congresswoman Edwards. I was interested in something that you said, and also Congresswoman Rodgers said. As we draw down our troops, I think the women come back very passionate. But the lion's share of resources are going to still remain in the Department of Defense, which I think still has a strategic blindness about the way women work in Afghanistan. We've done very well with elite women, we've done well with entrepreneurs in urban areas, but the majority of women who don't live in the urban areas still have a problem. As we pull back, what are the concrete things that can be done to ensure that women who are not in the elites, who are working in their own communities, are empowered so that they too can become part of the security solution in these communities and not only victims?
Well, Johanna, it's good to see you, and thank you for the question. Look, I think that the challenge of moving toward an Afghan government that has a centralized government structure and where you're trying to get resources from a central structure into communities is a challenge, whether those are defense dollars or whether they are on another assistance level. And this is not easy. And so it is why I think investments in making certain that the democratic structures and processes begin to work in Afghanistan are incredibly important. Because if those don't work, it isn't just that the money's being held in one place by the elites. It's just that there is not a mechanism if you don't have a governor in a state that's functioning and a police force and a judiciary and all of those things at the local level that are functioning that then allow that money to go through. You can see this, for example, when it comes to making decisions about resources going, for example, to maternal services, to things like midwifery. In some places that really does work. In other very rural communities, and let's not leave out the fact that in some of these rural communities, it isn't just the challenge of getting the resources in, it's a challenge of geography, it's a challenge of culture, it's a challenge of governance. And so I don't think that there's a one answer to the fact that the majority of the dollars that are there are in the defense mechanism. Even the ones that are not creating governmental structures throughout the country where there are trusted allies and arbiters in government to make certain that those resources go down to the community level continues to present an obstacle. I can only say that what we do is on a small scale and a large, we begin to provide the kind of modeling. There are places, for example, where there is good governance, and those resources are getting to communities. But I do think that that's because of good governance. I will say, lastly, one experience that I had in Afghanistan actually was, the circumstance of listening to rural women and urban women, Afghan women, in the same room talking about the to-do list. It was a very different to-do list. And so I think we should keep in mind that we're looking at these challenges externally, and there are internal operations in Afghanistan, even among women, about where it most makes sense to spend resources and who should be in charge of delivering those.
One more question. Yes, ma'am?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sweeta Nouri, and I'm an Afghan woman. I have 2 questions. Before I make these questions, I have some comments. Whenever we are talking about women problems in Afghanistan, we are raising burqas and face covering of women. But yet, there is major problems on the ground. Economic is the one thing, because the lack of economy on the ground made women in Afghanistan to consider as a property for resolution of conflict between families. They are using as an asset in the family, not being respecting being as a human. Through a decade, international community has drawn millions of dollars in Afghanistan. How much of this money reaches Afghan women, whatever they are living in urban areas or in the rural areas, we are not sure about. How these humanitarian aids reaches Afghan women, considering of the corruption and fraud that infected our government and some of the organizations and the companies that they are investing in Afghanistan. My question in this regard is how United States of America is making sure that the commitment that they have in terms of empowering women for another 10 years or further, how the assistance reaches Afghan women in rural area, in urban area. One thing. Another thing that it is always discussing on Taliban's, we should consider not only Taliban's, but there are 3 different groups. Taliban's, which we distinguish Taliban from moderate and from fundamental Talibans. And then we have insurgent groups that one of them headed by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and another is headed by Haqqani. So my question will be how the United States of America will facilitate this conversation with the Taliban to make sure that the women who gain through a decade are safe.
Maybe.
Yes.
Okay. I think that those are great questions, and they're very precise questions from somebody who's very knowledgeable. And we have a panel of individuals that are about to come up here who probably are in a very good position to offer or attempt to offer answers to that question. Donna may have some thoughts about it, but your question is so specific about future U.S. endeavors and individual tribal issues or group issues within Afghanistan. She may not be able to answer all of that as well as the panel can. So y'all stay tuned for the panel. Donna?
Thank you very much, and I have to leave as well, but I do want to just say this. I think one of the reasons that in my remarks you heard me discuss burqa or covering or not is because I don't think it matters. I think that we put more attention onto those kinds of issues that when you talk to Afghan women, you're an Afghan woman, there are a whole set of other things that are on the to-do list that aren't about that. And I think we can lose our focus about what's important for Afghan women when we don't focus on the to-do list that Afghan women have for us. And you will hear later from your experts about these particular issues. I will say an ongoing challenge, we know that this is true for U.S. or any international assistance, is making certain that we can begin to develop the kind of governance structures in place that will enable the assistance, whatever that assistance is, to get to the people who need it. Are we there yet? We all know we're not there yet. Are there higher levels of corruption than we need or want? Absolutely. And so I hope that your panel will provide some insight there, but I don't think there's a one of us in this room who would argue that we don't have to deal with the issue of governance and corruption in order to make certain that those assistance dollars reach the places that they need to, whether that is for women and girls or for communities across Afghanistan. I'd like to thank you all very much. I appreciate being here with you, and I appreciate your continuing to be thoughtful and engaged about this, because I think without the engagement of our public, one could easily see that the theory of out of sight, out of mind would certainly be true if we don't continue to stay focused on it. And so thank you very much.
Could I have the panel come up?
So we have a panel of real experts on this subject. The moderator for the panel will be Kathleen Keenest. You can see from the spelling of her name that I probably mispronounced it, but actually I didn't mispronounce it. It's simply misspelled. But it's Keenest. And Kathleen came from the World Bank to USIP some 5 years ago, realizing that there was very little focus on the critical role that gender plays in both conflict and peace building. Trained as an anthropologist, focused on gender and transition in Central Asia, Kathleen is perfectly placed to lead USIP's groundbreaking work on gender, conflict, and sexual violence. We're very lucky to have her. She's a superstar, and there are other superstars on this panel. Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to Mr. Carafano, Mr. Trulak, to the whole Heritage Foundation staff to make this possible today. Of course, I'm going to introduce Lisa in a moment, but we couldn't have done it without Lisa Curtis. And of course, to the members of the audience today, many of you I know are experts. Some of you are members of our Lessons Learned Working Group on Afghan women and Iraqi women. So I want to welcome you all here today. 2 years ago, the U.S. government launched the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. We joined nearly 50 other countries in the world with their own national action plans, as inspired by the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. The resolution passed in 2000 called for women's equal participation in promoting peace and security, and for greater efforts to protect women who are often exposed to more violence than men during and after conflict. As directed by the executive order signed by the President of the United States in December 2011, implementing this plan on women, peace, and security is a critical effort forward to achieving national and global security. So it is within that spirit today, the spirit of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, it is a great privilege to moderate this panel as we explore the gains that women in Afghanistan have made over the past decade, and also the critical role of the actions, ideas, and imagination that we all have here today, and those men and women in Afghanistan on the road ahead. In the interest of time, I'm going to really briefly introduce our distinguished panel of experts. I'm sorry that I can't dwell on all their marvelous accomplishments, but I know we have a lot to talk about, and we do want to have a dialogue here today with all of you. We will do this panel in one series of questions. Each panelist will have some remarks. They will add to their bio, I hope, and give a little personal context. And then a second round of questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. And hopefully some of your own ideas, questions may have been answered in this process. So without further delay, I would like to introduce our 5 experts, beginning on my left, and I'm going to briefly introduce each of them and then ask Hosai Wardak to begin contextualizing our panel here. Ms. Hosai Wardak is currently the Afghanistan Senior Visiting Expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She'll be with us through July this year. She brings with her great program development background with extensive work in the United Nations, both inside and outside of Afghanistan. She works most recently for Equality, for Peace and Democracy. She's very involved in looking at community-based monitoring mechanisms by using the national budget as the main monitoring tool in Kabul and Jalalabad. She will have a paper out on this later this summer. I want to welcome to Jose's left, Charlotte, otherwise known as Charlie Ponticelli. She's the former Senior Coordinator for International Women's Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Charlie began her 23-year career in government on Capitol Hill in 1978, serving most recently as the Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. Ms. Ponticelli was also the State Department Senior Coordinator for International Women's Issues, Senior Advisor for State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And I could spend probably about the hour, but we're very happy to have you with us today, Charlie. To Charlie's left is Claire Lockhart, Chief Executive Officer, Institute for State Effectiveness. Claire is the co-founder and CEO of an organization that really talks about building good governance. She works in countries not only in Afghanistan, but around the world to support leaders and managers to find paths for their country's stability and prosperity. She served in Afghanistan as an advisor to the UN during the Bonn process and to the Afghan government between the years of 2001 and 2005. She is co-author with Ashraf Ghani of Fixing Failed States, and we look forward to your comments in a few moments. To Claire's left is my colleague, Andrew Wilder, Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He joined USIP in August 2010 as the director, but prior to joining the Institute, Dr. Wilder served as Research Director for Politics and Policy at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University. Andrew will share with us his many years of experience in Pakistan and Afghanistan. He has done extensive research on subnational governance, elections, and police reform efforts in Afghanistan. Welcome, Andrew. And last but certainly not least is our new colleague, at least my new colleague, Lisa Curtis, who is the Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Lisa analyzes America's economic, security, and political relationships with India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other nations of South Asia. She has joined the Heritage Foundation but prior to that was the professional staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 3 years. She was in charge of South Asia issues for the chairman at the time, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. Again, I apologize in advance to each of you if I've not given full credit, but I know that people want to hear from you. And we want to begin our conversation this afternoon really with this emphasis on what have we gained? Because we know we spend a lot of time focusing on the victimization of women in Afghanistan, but sometimes we lose sight of truly what things were like before and what are probably the gains that are most at risk as we move forward in this transition. And I've asked each of the panelists to take about 3 to 5 minutes to both contextualize what they see now but most importantly over the past decade. And a few of them will give you a 2-decade view of the world in Afghanistan. Okay, one, but I think you have about 3 decades you can speak to.
3 decades.
But in 3 to 5 minutes, Hosai, please begin our contextualization.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. I'm not sure if I'll be able actually to speak about 3 decades in 5 minutes, but I'll try. Well, given the fact that actually the topic is to talk about the last decade's gains, I'd like to actually start up with a personal story, which was hopefully highlight the development that has been made. When I initially came back to Afghanistan in 2003 after living in Pakistan, I started working on the issues of women, and unlike everybody else, I had many dreams to work utilizing different skills that I had. And one of the issues that I took upon myself was actually working through religious leaders and advocating for the women's rights. In the whole process, I had to coordinate my efforts with Ministry of Hajj and Religious Affairs. And I requested them that in the provinces that I will be working in, they have to assign a coordinator that would help me and assist me, of course, in setting up the community-based conversations and getting the communities and reaching to the rest of the religious leaders. When I went to East in Nangarhar, I met Inayatullah Sharifi, a local Maulawi who was introduced to be my focal point from Ministry of Hajj and Religious Affairs. The very first time I met him, I realized I was not welcomed at all. He started up telling me about the different issues, including saying why I'm working, and the fact that my family allowed me to travel all the way from Kabul alone and to be there and to sit with men who are not related to me by family. I continued working with him no matter how much I felt that I'm not welcomed with him, by him actually, and then obviously accompanying him to the different community meetings and reaching to the rest of religious leaders that we went and spoke to them. Now time moves fast forward, and here I was, leaving Afghanistan for my assignment with the rest of the UN organizations, and then I left with UNICEF to travel to Azerbaijan. I returned back in 2011 to get married. Now this is a different story that is coming out. On the early hours of the day of my wedding, I received a phone call. And a soft, gentle male voice at the end of the phone who greeted me and told me how happy he was that I'm back. And after obviously listening to his soft words, I kindly asked him to introduce himself. And the person was nobody else but Maulawi Inayatullah Sharifi, who said that he traveled all the way from Nangarhar to Kabul, and if he can actually perform the religious side of my wedding. So he came and performed the religious side of my wedding. And what was interesting that he said at the end of my marriage ceremony to one of my family members was that I'm too old to have another daughter. And unlike other mullahs, I have only one wife. I have no intention of going for another. But if I will ended up having a granddaughter, I'd like to name her Hosai. And for me, beside being the happiest day of my life to get married, obviously that was one of he really and definitely added to the happiness that I had on that day. during the last decade, we have come a long way. And I think that have been, witnessed with the different developments that each and every one of us, even if we would like to Google about the developments made for Afghan women, we can witness that. 10 years before, the life expectancy for the women were 44 years. And today we are having it back at 62. Back in 2001, we had women dying giving childbirth. We had 1,600 women in each 100 live birth. If we put it in simple terms, we can say every 2 hours we were losing a woman because of pregnancy complications or during childbirth. Today that actually decreased to 460. Back then we had no girls actually going to school. Today we have more than 3 million girls going to school. In 2001, we had absolutely no women actually in the position of authority, and before that. Today, more than 28% of our parliament and in the lower house are actually women. I can continue with the list and actually mention so many achievements that are there. But I'd like to stop here to say that though these figures are there, and it's actually thrilling us to say that we have come a long way, but I think we have to also emphasize to say that we still have a long way to go. And I think, I keep on saying that we have got different processes in place that we have to ensure are transparent so that we don't have women's rights to be the victim of those processes in the country at the moment. And I'd like to say that the current peace and transition processes, we can even look at it as an opportunity for women, but also we can actually look at it as a threat for the women's rights in the country. And I'd like to present saying that when we were doing a research on the women's access to higher education. And while we were interviewing girls, one of the girls in Badakhshan, we said, why is it that she's actually not, coming to the university, which was there? She said, well, Taliban are coming back, so why is it that I have to come and continue my education while I will be asked to sit back at home? So if this is gonna be the perception of the women, I'm afraid then we are going to point out a very negative picture. So I think the actual work starts now. When the international community is leaving, when resources are shrinking, and that we know that the chances and opportunities are actually limiting. This is the time that actually we need the help and assistance much more than we actually needed in 2001. Thank you.
Thank you, Hosai. The actual work starts now. Charlie, what kind of work have you seen over the last decade?
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about where we are now in terms of the situation of Afghan women, which I think can be summed up in 2 words: progress and peril. I think that for many of us, the real story is about the great achievements that Hosai's just mentioned. But it's also about the individuals that we've had the chance to work with, the hundreds of Afghan women who I and so many others of us here in the room have had the honor of getting to know over this past decade. We know their names. I can see their faces. These are real people that we worked for. And I think sometimes people don't understand the human faces behind the statistics. When I think of the women that we've worked with who are parliamentarians, ministers, civil servants, members of provincial councils, and not just the elite from across Afghanistan. They're also lawyers and judges, teachers, journalists, midwives, doctors, community health workers, and they're entrepreneurs and business leaders, including some women who even own their own construction business. I think that we spent a lot of time, and some good time, looking at best practices. Sometimes I get a little impatient because I think, look, we know what the best practices are. We know what's worked pretty good, and we know what has worked maybe not so good. But we know what the best practices are. We just have to do them. I think that one of the best practices around is the work of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. And my colleague, Lauren Lovelace, the executive director of the council, is here today. For the past 12 years, council members have been directly involved in, and I thought that was a good mention the Congresswoman made of the metrics and matching the talk with the results, the money with the impact. But that's where the council comes in, because our member-sponsored projects, public-private partnerships have been very low cost, sometimes no cost. They've been strategically targeted initiatives, and they've had measurable and sustainable impact. They've improved healthcare, expanded educational opportunities, and they've developed women leaders in the public and private sectors. As one council member once put it, initially she said, it felt like digging at a mountain with a spoon, and then the spoon became a shovel, and the shovel became a bulldozer. And despite the ongoing challenges, the council and its members will continue to pave the way. I did want to just briefly mention 3 specific projects that I've been directly involved in. 3 organizations. One wonderful organization is the Bayat Foundation. Since 2005, it's contributed more than 200 projects to Afghanistan and built 12 maternal health facilities in Afghanistan, treating more than 600,000 women and children across Afghanistan in 8 provinces across Afghanistan in the past 5 years alone. At the Bayat Foundation, our team is working on a telemedicine project now to expand training and treatment to some of the most remote villages and communities in Afghanistan. And working with our sister organization, Afghan Wireless, we're working on a mobile phone project for women, an Avon Lady type of approach that will allow women to work as mobile phone franchisees. It's called Phones to Women, and it would allow women to sell phones to other women within their own villages, provide an income-generating opportunity while expanding women's access to life-saving solutions. I do want to mention, too, because it hits another main goal of our public-private partnerships, and that's the initiative to educate Afghan women. Since 2002, IEAW has provided scholarships to 86 young Afghan women studying at 24 colleges and universities here in the United States. One of the students is here with us today, Hasina. And she is a 2010 graduate of Roger Williams University, now working on assignment for Creative Associates. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the wonderful board of IEAW. Susan Crudgington is here. She's vice chair of the IEAW board. By linking education and internships to training and placement opportunities back in Afghanistan, IEAW is helping to build the critical mass of future women leaders for Afghanistan. And finally, some of us at lunch had an interesting discussion about practical programs. I want to mention another actually it's a company, and it's called TTI Global. It's a woman-owned business based in Detroit. The CEO traveled to Afghanistan on one of the U.S. government-sponsored trade missions. She decided to go back and actually open an office in Afghanistan. And she's moving forward on a technical skills training program for young Afghan women and men. These are the kinds of practical skills that are highly portable and can be put to use not just in the automotive sector, but in the agricultural, mining, and construction sectors as well. Jobs and job skills for young women and young men are a critical part of the solution, especially considering the millions who will never have a shot at higher education. So 3 projects, hitting 3 key areas: expanding life-saving solutions, including through technology; 2, building the cadre of future women leaders; and 3, practical and technical skills, which really are, can create jobs and pave the way for peace and security in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, for giving us some of the ideas of what kind of concrete projects help build gains in the past and in the way forward. Claire, give us some of the context of your time in Afghanistan. what you've seen over the last decade.
Well, thank you very much to the conveners first for giving us all this opportunity. And I'd like to start by marking the really remarkable courage and leadership of Afghan women who over the last decade have been at the forefront of making the very changes we're talking about. And I'll just give you 3 vignettes from the experience that I've seen. I had the privilege to be at the Bonn Agreement, which was the negotiation that set up the government more than a decade ago in Afghanistan. And there were essentially the dictates of 1325 that requires women to be at the table was not really followed, and it was essentially a gathering of mainly very elderly, very wise men. But there was a light in this process, which was a civil society gathering took place in Germany a little ways away, and the delegate that they chose to speak for them was a 17-year-old woman. And she came and she spoke to this gathering, and it was just electrifying. And what she really set out was the expectation that she and her generation had for these men. And above all, their dream was to live ordinary lives. They just wanted to live normal lives with dignity and with respect. But she did give them a warning. She said, one day our generation will hold you to account. And I think that moment is coming. A second story. A few years later, a large delegation from the European Union came with one of the commissioners to discuss what their support was going to be, and they came and met the ministries. There was a big delegation from Europe and a big delegation from the Afghan government. And about halfway down the talking points, the commissioner just stopped and laughed, and he said, "This is the point where I'm meant to lecture you about inclusion of women in government." And he laughed because he'd come with 23 men and no women on his delegation. But in front of him, the panel from the Afghan government was predominantly women. So I think sometimes we just a reminder to mark the real gains and some of the transformation in some parts of the country and government that have taken place. And then just a third short story. At one point there was a woman, extraordinary woman, Simagani Masumi, who had been appointed to be director of budget for the whole country. And when she first turned up in her office, the men all resigned and said, "We're not working for you." Well, they said, "We're not working for you." She said, "Well, you're fired." 3 days later, they all came back and asked for their jobs back. And after that, she had no problem at all. So I think to me, again, that shows what's, with courage, what's possible, and the men do accommodate in the society. Today, I think it's so important that we're looking at the gains. I think as many of us have noticed over the years, for the first 5 years after 2001, the media was pretty universally happy and was talking about the progress. And then it switched, and all we've heard is negativity for 5 years. And I think that needs some correction. And so to look and examine the gains. And for those of you, of us, who are in positions of power or influence or knowledge and information, I think we have the opportunity and perhaps also the obligation to try and set the record straight. And especially with the US and other publics around the world who've got the impression that it's all negative. It isn't. Right. And how do we come up with a more balanced picture of what's there? And also not only what are the risks of the future, but what are the opportunities that still exist in the society? And then what are those? I mean, the two previous speakers have spoken so compellingly to the big picture and some of the examples of the gains. I think, there are the gains for women, but let's also look at the general context. This is the overall gains in democracy, in institution building, in the economy, despite the big challenges that remain. That's actually set the context for all citizens, including women and girls, to make the changes. So in order for women to thrive going forwards, I think the overall process absolutely needs to stay on track. The second is then behind these overall gains, of course, it rests on people. So who are the men and the women who've been fighting for, working for these changes that have made it possible for the whole country? One of them, Aziz Raesh, was here in the US on a scholarship recently, and he's just written a book called Let Me Breathe. And he argues that the last decade has literally given him and his communities a chance to breathe, literally and figuratively. And they've been able to invest in education. And for many of their initiatives, they haven't taken a cent of foreign assistance. They've mobilized their own resources to make those changes. And I'll highlight just one other program, and Congresswoman Edwards was talking a little bit before about, one is the main challenges for the money, whether it's foreign assistance or domestic revenue. How does it actually reach people, especially in the rural areas? And there's one program, as an example, it's not the magic bullet, but there's one program that's an example of that. The National Solidarity Program has given block grants now to 31,000 villages, but as some of the women will say, women and men who've received, they said, it's not about the money. And then they say, don't tell her that, they might take away the money, and I don't have that authority. But it's about the fact that we are trusted to make our own decisions. And through this program, there have actually been 31,000, each of these 31 villages have had their own election at the village level, secret ballot elections for a village council. And as part of this, there have been more than 100,000 women in the rural areas elected to village councils at the local level. And that, I think, is one example of the opportunities I'm talking about we see ahead. The 100,000 women who've had this leadership experience, the decision-making experience, and they're, you know, what an incredible network to engage with each other and for any of us from the outside to engage with. Just closing with a question, one of the things that Aziz has asked is, you know, should we continue what we're doing? Should we keep it up? And he said, are you outsiders, are you going to be with us for the next chapter?
Thank you, Claire. Setting the record straight, I like that, and in many ways we're trying to reframe the narrative that's sometimes gets simplified in our policy conversations, and so I appreciate you putting that forward to the conversation here. Andrew, please help us see even where you've come from. You know, you've had the perspective of being across the border for many years as a youth, and then in the country for many years as a professional. I think it's both very helpful.
No, thank you, Kathleen. I also want to thank Lisa for helping organize this event and reach out to us to organize some of these joint initiatives with USIP. Yeah, I was going to start off by saying my first visit to Afghanistan, I think, was in 1969 or 70, and it was a family holiday up to Bamiyan to see the Buddhas when they still existed. But lest you think I'm much older than I actually am, that I do want to emphasize that was a family holiday. But I started working in about 86 on cross-border programs in Afghanistan with various humanitarian development organizations, and I thought I would actually just talk a little bit about that experience, just again, I think, to give a sense of the progress we've made to date. Because I absolutely agree with some of the previous speakers and what Claire just said, that there is so much doom and gloom in the papers these days. And I think, you know, many of us are disappointed. I mean, compared in 2002, I remember the incredible hopes. I moved to Kabul in January 2002, and just this incredible optimism then, and the first Nowruz and, you know, Afghan New Year celebration, where for the first time in many years, Afghans could go out and picnic again, and you have traffic jams heading north out of Kabul up to Shamali to picnic for the New Year festival. And there's, again, a lot of hope, and I think we're not today where we had hoped we would be. But it's very important not to lose sight of what has been achieved. And just to give some examples, I was a Save the Children director for Afghanistan and Pakistan through, you know, quite much of the 1990s and certainly all of the Taliban period. But we were running all the education in the refugee camps in Baluchistan at that time for Afghan refugees. And we took over that program in 1996, and there was hardly any girls in school. And this was pre-Taliban period then. And really had to work hard to how do we create incentives to get girls into school. And we tried everything, and the most, ultimately what proved to be quite successful was tins of edible oil. For every month that you kept your daughter in school, your family would get a tin of edible oil and some wheat from WFP. And it actually, over time, ended up having some impact. And about 4 or 5 years later, by about 2000, 2001, about 30% of the children in grades 1 to 3 were enrolled in school in the refugee camps and were actually continuing to go to school without incentives. The problem, however, was dropout rates. It was very difficult to keep girls in school. But of course, the situation in Afghanistan was so much worse during that time when girls were prevented from going to school. And so I think just to get a sense, again, the statistics, Jose has already mentioned, just to, I think whatever 8 million children in primary school today, of which 37% are girls. And again, I think we can complain maybe about is the quality of education up to snuff, but the real problem now is not demand for education, which is what it was in the 1990s in the refugee camps, or not allowed to have education, which is what it was for many girls, except those who had access to home schools run by some incredibly brave women during those dark years of the Taliban. But the problem now is much more of a supply problem and a quality issue, and I'd rather have that problem than the lack of demand problem which we had before. So and another example I just wanted to highlight was, again, it's already been mentioned, just how, I think Congresswoman Edwards said at this press conference, half the journalists were women. And, we all also heard about how women are, especially at least in the urban areas, you just see across all these professions, lawyers, business women, professionals in all walks of life. And just to highlight the progress in terms of mobility and visibility of women. And I think, again, the role of the media in that has played a prominent role. But again, back to when the Taliban took over Kabul in 1996, our office had about 100 staff, half of whom were women. And the Taliban, of course, said women aren't allowed to work, except in the health sector. So we quickly changed all their job descriptions, and all the women quickly became health workers. But they weren't allowed to come to the office. They could work in the health sector, but we were able, through friendly Talibs at the Indira Gandhi Hospital, to have a monthly staff meeting, at the hospital, where the friendly Talib would warn us if unfriendly Taliban came along, we'd quickly disperse. But again, that was the context in which women were working and how women could actually meet with male counterparts in that environment. And again, you look at where we are today, it's really quite phenomenal, and I think it is really important to remember that context. Tremendous gains have been made. And then just lastly, just Kabul. I mean, I think those of you who saw Kabul in the early days after 9/11, or even during the Taliban, I guess perhaps the one positive feature was there was no traffic. But overall, I would take the traffic of Kabul today over what Kabul was like under the Taliban then. We estimated a population of maybe 500,000 now, but probably between 4 to 5 million, a buzzing town. But parts of it, large parts of it, sort of really resembled sort of the images you see of Dresden, after the bombings in World War II. And again, it's hard to find that anymore. I actually did think that one or two neighborhoods of Kabul should be just kept the way they were as a reminder of what the situation was, and what if we don't get this right, and Afghans don't get this right, collectively, it could go back to. And so I think I'll leave it at that, and in the next remarks, maybe talk a bit more about what I think maybe needs to be done to try to prevent that. How do we protect these gains?
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. And also, bringing out this whole idea of imaginative incentives, that, some of what has gone on before is thinking outside the box. What can encourage change in social networks like that? I think that's a great example about the tins of edible oil and weed. Lisa, please bring us your perspective.
Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to Kathleen, Andrew, and Lori Schultzheim, who I know is somewhere in the audience. There she is. It was a pleasure to bring this program together. It's not every day that the Heritage Foundation and USIP come together for a joint program. So there was a lot of pieces to put together, but I think it sends a very strong message that this is an issue that both of our institutes highly value. And hopefully it will demonstrate that the U.S. is committed to the women of Afghanistan. And that message is heard both here and in Afghanistan. So in terms of my first experience with Afghanistan was when I arrived for my tour as a diplomat in Pakistan in September 1994, about a month before the Taliban first went into Afghanistan, the famous trip led by the former Pakistani Interior Minister Nasirullah Babar, leading the convoy of Taliban into Kandahar. Now, while I was a diplomat in Pakistan, I handled the human rights portfolio, so I had the opportunity to work with many courageous Pakistani women who were making a difference in their own societies, putting their own lives at risk, and was sort of watching from a distance what was happening in Afghanistan, where the Taliban were increasingly repressing the women and the minority communities. And by the time I was leaving Pakistan in the spring of 1996, of course, Osama bin Laden had come to the region, and it was clear that the Taliban were becoming increasingly radical, tied with international terrorism. And so having witnessed what the Taliban were capable of almost 20 years ago, I, for one, am very skeptical about this idea of reconciliation process. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think right now it's very difficult as the U.S. and coalition forces are withdrawing. The Taliban actually believe they are winning, and this is not good news for women in Afghanistan. And it's not good news for U.S. national security. One of the tools that the Taliban uses to instill fear in the overall Afghan population is through subjugation of women. And we saw this through restricting their ability to work, to go to school, even access to health care in some cases. Andrew, I guess you saw a few exceptions to that, but I think by and large, it was a fairly dire situation. And I see few signs that it would be much different now, that the Taliban have really changed their tune on this. And I think that is why it's so important to not allow the gains that we have seen to slip away. And so in talking about women and their role in Afghan society, we are not merely dealing with a side issue of little consequence. In fact, the fate of women in Afghanistan will reflect the broader trends in the country and indeed the nature of the Afghan state, whether it will be a stable society able to control terrorism or an unstable society that again becomes a terrorist safe haven. And that is why the issue of women in Afghanistan is directly related to core U.S. national security interests. So Kathleen's question was, talk about some of the gains that you've seen, personal connection to those. So I would focus on two, and I think Hosai also talked about the increase in the number of girls going to school, over 3 million now, which is just remarkable. And I think to a few years ago when I was speaking at Middlebury College up in Vermont and met an Afghan woman student, and she had grown up in Afghanistan during Taliban rule. She was probably 10, 12 years old at the time, and she had to attend school in secret. So she told me the story about pretending to go to somebody's house to do something, but really she was learning, she was studying. And here she was at a wonderful American university. So there is a very tangible result of what we've seen over the last 10 years. And the other issue that stands out for me is the fact that we have women parliamentarians. And I think the fact that a quarter of the seats are reserved for women is quite a remarkable thing. And I got to experience this in 2009 during my visit to Afghanistan and meeting with a group of parliamentarians, which of course included women. And it just was so different than the Afghanistan of the 1990s. And it really demonstrated women being part of the political space in Afghanistan. And it's so important to sustain these gains that we have seen. And I'll just leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to I'm going to pick this right up because I'm looking at our time and I really want to make sure that our audience has an opportunity to interact. And I'm going to turn to you, Lisa, and come back down our panel here and ask you to talk about what are the challenge, hurdles, and opportunities that lie ahead. And if you could explain what you mean by 2014 withdrawal. I think we all have a little different dimension, a little bit of kind of contextualizing that issue.
Well, 2014 is not the end of U.S. and international engagement in Afghanistan. I think what it is, it's a shift from a combat role to a more supportive role of the Afghan security forces. But it also means the U.S. will remain diplomatically, economically, financially engaged with the country. I don't think it's a 1989 scenario where the U.S. did literally, turn its back on Afghanistan after the Soviets left. I just don't see that we're headed in that direction. I know there have been some fears, particularly in the region of that, but it's not the direction that we see this administration going in. And I think there's enough congressional members who realize the importance of remaining engaged with the country. We can talk about troop levels. I think it would be useful if the administration showed its cards on what the troop presence will be like after 2014. I know this is a bit of controversy there, but we've heard the CENTCOM commander, General James Mattis, talk about his view of the numbers. I think he's thrown out 13 to 14,000 U.S. forces, and in addition there would be maybe 6,000 to 7,000 international forces, which would total about 20,000 being there for training and advising. And I think we should be able to keep a strong residual force in Afghanistan to maintain some of the gains that we have talked about, and just remembering this is the country where the attacks on 9/11 originated. But aside from the troop withdrawal issue, the most important event in 2014 obviously is the elections. And so, this is an opportunity for, hopefully a relatively peaceful democratic transition in which women will fully participate. This is an opportunity for women in different sectors of the society to come together on a common cause to ensure their full participation in the elections. And a stronger political voice for the women in Afghanistan can actually contribute to breaking down these ethnic barriers that still exist in the country. And then lastly, I would just talk about the importance of women becoming involved in these security issues. I've talked about my skepticism on the reconciliation process. However, if we ever do get to a point where it might move forward, and I would say that some of this relies on Pakistan and its policies. If we saw Pakistan, for instance, cracking down on the Taliban and Haqqani network on its side of the border, or using its leverage to bring these groups to compromise, Pakistan has a large role here. If we saw some of that, and this track would move forward at some point, obviously women have to be part of this process, and we simply can't think about gambling away women's rights in an effort to strike some kind of grand bargain with the Taliban. And that's only going to happen if women have a seat at that table. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for bringing in the regional perspective. It's something that I think, the leveraging of these relationships across border, very critical view right now. Again, Andrew, just a few comments, just in
very briefly. Again, to me, the key issue to protect the gains for all Afghans, but women in particular, I think, is to prevent a return back to civil war in the situation which we had. Because in that situation of deteriorating security, the first losers in that are going to be women and children in particular. So I think that to me is the key. And I think to try to do whatever we can to try to prevent that return to civil war, I would highlight three things. One is, again, Lisa has mentioned, I think the troop number issues is important. I think one aspect is on the security side, the role it can play, but in some ways more important for me is the political role it can play, that some troops are a symbol of our commitment to a long-term engagement in Afghanistan. There's ambivalence in Afghanistan about U.S. troop numbers. I mean, one cabinet member told me, if you took a poll today, do you want international troops to stay in Afghanistan, the majority of Afghans would say no. If you took a poll an hour later and said, do you want the international troops to leave, the majority would say no. I mean, so it's a complicated issue, but But the political significance of troops remaining also is probably the most tangible sign we can give that we're not going to abandon Afghanistan. There's also the practical consideration that if there are a significant number of U.S. and international troops there, the chances of international aid and other development resources continuing to flow to Afghanistan as a priority are going to be much higher. I've actually been a critic that in the past decade we've been actually tried to spend too much money in Afghanistan, certainly not relative to the needs in Afghanistan, but relative to the capacity to spend money effectively and accountably in that kind of context. So I actually see a reduction in some of the aid levels, not necessarily as a bad thing, but you certainly don't want to go from far too much to far too little. How do we get the balance right? And also the pace of drawdown, you don't want to, again, I've said, once you created this war economy, aid economy balloon, the answer isn't to pop it, but to let the air out in a somewhat controlled manner. And I actually think we're going to see significant increases in the effectiveness of aid as some of those aid levels decrease. But then the third point I wanted to make, and again, this is something that USIP has been emphasizing for 2 years now, is again the critical importance of the political transition in Afghanistan. It's something Jim Marshall mentioned in his opening remarks, and Lisa also just reiterated that it's very hard for me to see how, if we don't end up with an election in 2000, a relatively credible election that produces a legitimate outcome, I then think the odds of things heading south after that are much higher. And I think this is why we've been, for the U.S. Institute of Peace, the idea of the elections is critical to future peace and stability in Afghanistan. And a very important part of that's going to be the participation of women in those elections. And how do we protect the gains of women's participation in political life in Afghanistan at unprecedented levels? And so yeah, it's one of the activities actually Hosai and Kathleen are working on in terms of a joint USIP initiative with EPD, Hosai's NGO, to try to increase the role of young Afghan women in the political process in Afghanistan. As candidates, as election workers and as voters, how do we invest significantly in civic education and voter education early on? Often this is left to the last minute, and I think we really need to get international community actively focusing on supporting civic education efforts, in part to generate more demand for the election. I mean, there's now skepticism that they can happen. I think we need to be, as the international community and the U.S. in particular, really need to be signaling very clearly and strongly that the elections have to happen, that they are actually our number one foreign policy priority in Afghanistan for this next year, because if they don't happen, it's very hard for me to see how the security transition is going to go well, and I think it's very hard for me to see, without a legitimate government, how economic resources are going to continue to flow to Afghanistan. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Great summary there, Andrew. Claire, additional comments? Counter comments?
Yes. I think that one of the things that we can do is actually to change our language, the words that we use. And when we say withdrawal, for many Afghans, I think they hear abandonment again. And if it isn't about completely zeroing out, if it's not about withdrawing all our engagement and going to a kind of isolationism, then if we use a different word, and I think transition is a word, it begs the question from where to where. But as Lisa said, it's a shift to a different kind of engagement. So I think so how do we get the terms right and not scare people? Because if people sense there's going to be complete abandonment, this drives the kind of hedging behavior that will nudge the country further towards civil war and the very outcome we want to avoid. And I think paradoxically, the more that people can hear commitment and engagement, actually the less that commitment and engagement will be called upon. But also begs the question then, how does that engagement change? And part of it is a different kind of security relationship, but I do think we need to, as Andrew said, really question how the civilian assistance works. And I think for considerably less money, we can be driving towards considerably actually greater impacts with greater accountability and different mechanisms of engagement. Then sort of two areas. One is sort of specifically for women, and I think this upcoming program that USAID is putting into place, Women in Transition, let's get that right. Let's not see this as another failed Beltway development program that goes wrong, but how to get that right. That is an opportunity. And maybe three particular areas. One is women in education, particularly vocational and higher secondary education. big focus has happened on primary. That's great, but these women have now reached secondary age. Are they going to be equipped to enter the public and private service? Women in leadership, protecting those and equipping and helping to preserve the space in politics and government. And then women as economic agents. And as the economy hopefully shifts from an aid-driven one to one which is based on sort of sustainable pillars of the economy in agriculture, manufacture, services, and so on, are women going to have a role in those sectors? And that will actually depend back on that vocational training. And then I think beyond that, and very much agreeing with Andrew, for women to maintain the gains that they've made, it's the country overall that needs to stay on track. And absolutely the key make or break factor is going to be the elections. Are we sufficiently prepared? Are we making the minimal investments, as Jim mentioned, in the necessary conditions, especially civic education, voter education, civil society oversight of the elections? Second, the security commitment, a sufficient security commitment to give confidence of Afghan citizens and also the region that there isn't going to be a collapse. And then third, I think this economic opportunity, so that increasingly Afghan revenue can sustain the gains, but that will take some investment to get there.
Thanks, Claire. Building confidence, building relationships versus undermining that level of progress and trying to keep that energy moving forward versus, as you say, hedging behavior. Charlie, what's next?
Well, I just want to first echo what Claire said. It's amazing. This is the first time we've ever met, and we almost have, in some cases, identical talking points. But I'm a former language major, and to me, words matter. And we really have shifted from the emphasis of the word commitment in our lexicon in speaking about Afghanistan, and particularly the women of Afghanistan, to then transition 5 years ago to now drawdown and withdrawal. And I'm sorry, the new words in the lexicon are not exactly instilling confidence, and they do not, look at any dictionary, have a connotation of engagement. I think the real concern of a lot of Afghan women, we talked about tremendous fears. I think Phil Trulock used that phrase today. There are tremendous fears. And one of them, I believe, is generated by this, because in our words, Afghan women are hearing that we've moved somehow. Now, we can disagree, and we've worked hard on this, but that we've somehow moved from a message of, we will not abandon you, to, sorry, you're on your own. And let's face it, you can't have public-private partnerships if the one partner goes missing. I think that we've already seen a security situation it's already deteriorating. Things are getting harder, not easier, in terms of NGOs and organizations being able to do their work on the ground. So this is where the military and security side has to mesh with the civil society and private sector actor side. Many NGOs have already announced that they're scaling back. However, instead of scaling back, this is the time when we should be looking at a new surge for Afghanistan, a new kind of surge for Afghanistan. And I believe, and configured correctly, perhaps the Women in Transition program could be a way to provide this kind of surge. If it could find a way to focus on 3 areas. 1, focus on youth. Consider, folks, 2/3 of Afghanistan's population is under the age of 25. 42% of the population is under the age of 15, 1-5. Youth without education, youth without job opportunities, you have a recipe for disaster. Focus on education. As Chris Taylor of the American University of Afghanistan's Board of Directors has pointed out, quote, education is one of the most powerful tools for driving change from within. It's the tool the insurgents fear the most. And thirdly, as I said, focus on jobs. There was a great statement by Afghanistan's Minister for Rural Rehabilitation and Development a month or so ago. And he said, and it's a fabulous quote, and I read it perhaps once a week as I try to look at where we go from here in Afghanistan. He wrote in an article entitled, "A New Deal for Afghanistan," quote, "Few insurgents are driven by ideology. Many more are driven by employment. And here presents a key challenge, he wrote. How and where to create the 400,000 to 600,000 jobs needed each year in a country where, as I said, 2/3 of the population is aged 25 or younger. In my view, the minister wrote, it is unemployment rather than insurgency that poses the greatest threat to achieving a stable future for Afghanistan. And just lastly, for this New Deal to work, for this surge, as I like to call it, to work, it has to be one that invests in boys and men, as well as women and girls. As our Afghan sisters often tell us, the best way to help Afghan women is to keep sending the boys to school. And they also point out that if men don't have economic opportunity, we will never have peace. There's lots of ways we can do it. We have some great organizations with some great boots on the ground, and they're there to stay for as long as they can. We have some new approaches and some new opportunities through the use of technology. 8 out of 10 Afghan women now have some access, albeit in some cases limited, some access to mobile phone technology. As Phil Trulock and others here today have said, we have to continue this investment in the women of Afghanistan if Afghanistan and our own best interests are to succeed. It is not just a human rights issue. It is a development and a national security issue. It is the right thing to do, and it's the smart thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Why do we change the narrative? Instead of, as Charlie suggested, time is up, and instead say, time is now. What do you think?
Well, I think for the time that I have been in U.S., a couple of things that I'd like to highlight that I noticed. First of all, when there is a conference on Afghanistan, Afghanistan is always being picked up as a patient, and all the others in the region as doctors and paramedics that they have to come untreated, which I think the issue we have to expand it a little bit more and to see who are really in immediate need of care. And I think who should be treated as a patient rather than only living and putting Afghanistan on the patient's bed. I think that's something that is extremely important. My colleagues mentioned very well about the elections. And I think this time around it's going to be very difficult to get women to come out and vote for various reasons of security. I've even read the news of saying that there will be a few districts that they won't have a voter registration offices even, let alone having a polling station over there. To connect votes, rather than connecting it to an individual, but connecting it to the services that they are going to get at the end of the day. And I think that's extremely important to say that you're not going to vote for an individual because he's coming from a certain tribe, but you're going to vote for the services that you are going to get at the end of the day. And that's extremely important that we have to focus on. The other issue that I would like to say is that as much as we are working in Afghanistan to ask for accountability of resources provided to our government and the way they are spending it, I'd like to actually call on each and every US citizen that you have to also start, holding your government accountable for the resources that they are providing it for the Afghanistan. And I think we would only be able actually to ensure that each and every penny that you are paying in terms of tax, and it goes to services in Afghanistan, it's being actually provided and actually being spent wisely, that it was mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you, Husai, for bringing in also your story right now and what you're writing about in terms of budget accountability. So we look forward to hearing more about this. We have about 15 minutes, and I know that's not a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take questions 3 at a time so we can get a lot of ideas out on the table. And would you please stand up, introduce yourself, because we really do want to have this as a conversation, where you're from, and make your question or comment very brief. And I'm going to hold you to only one comment or question. Please. In the back. Wait, I'm going to do 1, 2, and was there a third? 3 in the front row. Okay? And then I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Naqib Salarzai, and I'm from Afghanistan. First of all, I thank Andrew and Hosai for raising this accountability issue in the budget. And I also personally, my opinion is that I'm also, like, as an Afghan, I'm not concerned about this 50% dropout, as Dr. Bird is here. He mentioned that post 2014 there will be like 50% dropout in the international assistance, and this can be easily, like, somehow offset with managing the budget very wisely. One example could be the unnecessary expenses of bringing a lot of internationals to Afghanistan and paying them ridiculous amount of salaries. That for one salary of one international consultant, you can hire like more than 20 Afghans who can do almost the same quality of job. And my question is, what is the program of, what do you think that in a society like Afghan, which is a very male dominating society, only empowering women are very important, or also like working with male in order to convince them to let women have initiative in the community? 3 million of girls going to school sounds very good. It's like 10% of 30 million. But how many of them go and they continue beyond 12th grade?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to bring that perspective in as well. We did while we're bringing the microphone down here, USIP with our partners did a study, and one of the #1 lessons learned is you must include men in women's programming, or it becomes just another silo. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Marzia Nauruzi, and I'm also one of the initiative to educate Afghan women students. And I graduated last spring. I learned a lot today. Thank you very much. And I would like to know if it's possible to have conversations like this in Afghanistan for people. Because as you said, a lot of Afghan people now, they are losing hope. Last time I talked to my father, he said that in Herat, people, even they don't want to buy houses and lands because they are waiting to see what's going to happen after 2014. And a lot of people, they are leaving the country because they think that Taliban are coming back. And this also encourages the Taliban because they say, okay, United States is leaving now, and now we have the opportunity to come back. So like today, I gained a lot of hope for my country, and I hope that I will be able to go back to Afghanistan and help women, which is my passion. And I also agree that when we say helping women and educating women, we should also say educating men and young boys. I'm here today because my father supported me. There are millions of Afghan women who are smart, who are talented, but their community, their families don't let them even get education. The media, the international NGOs teach them about their rights. Once they go home, their family members brings them down. That's why the number of women who commit suicide is increasing, because women are learning about their rights, but male in the families don't support them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing that perspective of what the impact of all this is on day-to-day life, that life is on pause, please. And then we'll go the next round. I see.
And I'm Barbara Dillon Hillis, and I'm working with a U.S. government contractor that implements a justice sector program in Afghanistan. And the question that I have for you, or an observation that I have after listening to all of you talk, is that in terms of gains, I don't have the experience that you have cumulatively, but I think in the last 10 years, if you pay attention to the gender issues being cross-cutting issues in legal development that has been occurring in Afghanistan, you will be quite surprised. The underpinning of a normal society or a stable society is really the structure of their laws, the implementation of the laws, and the institutions being able to implement those laws. So I'm just mentioning this to you, and maybe you have a comment or two. Thank you.
That's great additional point. You're right. Okay, I have a choice here to make, and these are such great comments. I want to just take a few more because I think we need to get them out, and then I'll let you each say something, wrap up, and we'll be done. All right?
Great.
All right. There were two people up here and one here. All right? And so that will be it.
Thank you. My name is Sabira Qureshi. I'm an independent consultant working on education in Afghanistan. Lots of questions come to mind,
Yeah,
but of course,
only
keeping to your stipulation for one, having worked on both sides of a very porous border, Pakistan and Afghanistan, I'd just like to sort of pick up on the comment that was made about a regional perspective, and I think Andrew mentioned, and Lisa also mentioned about Pakistani women, and I think it would be very, very useful, particularly from the point of view of bringing women to the peace talks table, is to bring support of women from across the region, particularly Pakistan, in addition to Afghanistan, and from India and from Iran, and to make sure that that voice, Afghan women are not alone in that voice for peace, because it's eventually going to affect women in that entire region. So I'd just like to reiterate that particular point. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I think you were next, far back, all right? And then we'll end in the front row here.
Hi, my name is Habiba Tasalla from PashtunWomanViewpoint.com. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Andrew Wilder for his efforts in Save the Children. And also, I was one of the students who went in Nangarhar and Peshawar. And I have definitely used the help of Save the Children and also Nebraska University for what their efforts in the books they used to send us. I have a question for Ms. Wardak. My question is that people argue that in Afghanistan, girls get literate, they don't get educated. And that's why most of them, they choose to go to madrasas rather than schools. And families do send them to madrasas rather than schools. That how would you approach those families?
Thank you very much, Habib. Final question or comment right in front here.
Hello, Nicholas Demeter, gender enthusiast. The question I have is about the men and boys issue. It's, yes, men and boys should be a part of it, and women need to be a part of it, of all these jobs, and we need to have 100,000 jobs every day coming out. How do you reconcile that? Because there aren't enough jobs for everybody, and you can't have every man have a job before every woman can start to have a job. So what is the thinking behind how to include men, or maybe educate men better that it's okay for a woman to be a breadwinner and not the male? So rather than having both sides fighting for jobs, more awareness about the ability of women to be a breadwinner in the household.
Thank you, Nick. We're going to wrap up the questions here. I'm sorry that we couldn't go on for another hour. Such experts and so much experience in the audience. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to not, of course, answer all 7 questions there, but to take one and very briefly, and this will be your summary remarks. And Jose, I'm going to begin with you, and Lisa, you will wrap it up today.
Well, thank you very much. I promised to answer one question, but they are such an appealing question that I'd like to actually tab on a couple of them. To the comments and the question that actually came from Mr. Salarzai and Ms. Naurouzi is that I cannot agree with you more on that. And I'd like to actually pass on saying that, gender equality and women's rights cannot be achieved in isolation and only with women. Until and unless we partner with men, young boys, and religious leaders and community elders. And that's extremely important. We can talk about hours of the initiatives which are on the ground, working with them, but they are all actually partners organizations, that they are actually very closely working on those issues. And I think I have mentioned the story of me and Inayatullah Sharifi on how we started working together, though at the beginning it was more of a love and hate kind of a relationship. And to Ms. Nawrouzi, I first of all, I'd like to say that I want to see you back in Afghanistan. And that's important because, I'd like to pass on a message saying those youth who are actually coming to US, we want to see them back in Kabul or in the provinces to continue actually working for the Afghans over there. And I'd like to pass on the same message. You cannot work on women's issues by only educating women, because as soon as they go back home and face domestic violence, it's kind of double bookkeeping. So you would only actually be able to achieve gender equality with partnering with men. With laws actually being implemented, one of the obstacles that we have in the country is that we have wonderful laws. And I think, as in Afghanistan, we have got many of them very quickly than many of the countries in the world, and as well as the action plans working in terms of enhancing women. But what's next is to implement them and to monitor the implementation of those laws. That's extremely important, because having a law and putting it in a shelf or gazetted is not enough, but to see whether that's being used in courts, and the judges and the prosecutors are actually being trained on how to use that one. It's important. With regard to involve women from the different countries, there's an initiative called Women's Regional Network. Proud to be one of their members. And what they are doing is actually to have women in the region as peace ambassadors. And soon they're going to have a peace caravan, which is going to start from Pakistan all the way in Afghanistan and then ended up in India, or even that way starting it up, that they are working, and this is an issue that they are definitely tackling in Afghanistan, to bring women from the other countries to talk about the issues of peace and involving women in the different positions. That's where I'd ended up, and I'd leave the rest of the panel members with concluding remarks that I'd like to say, and I keep on, those who have heard it, actually it's going to be a very boring message, but one thing that I'd like to pass on to say is that obviously with the life that you have is that I'm not sure whether I will be alive next year or not going back to Afghanistan. The situation probably will be bad or good, who knows. But one thing that I'd like to say is that the past 10 to 11 years were the best years that I had in my life, despite all those attacks, despite all those problems. Because I was in my country, serving my own people, and I was able actually to contribute for the development of my country. Thank you.
I'd like to take Nick's comment or question, and I hope I didn't mangle that terrific quote by the minister that I used. He wasn't saying necessarily this is doable. He said here's where the key challenge lies. That we can talk all we want about some of these issues, but if we don't talk about jobs and job opportunities, the situation of Afghan women will be sunk, the situation of Afghanistan will be sunk. You're talking about an economy, some of you know the figure better than I do, that's currently, 94, 96% dependent on foreign assistance. This is, in addition to the insecurity we've talked about as the big threat, the issue of corruption, which is another huge threat and has been a huge concern for the Afghan women leaders that we have worked with. But you have an economy that in this transition or drawdown or withdrawal is going to be hanging very precariously. And I don't see it as a zero-sum game. I myself have seen projects very successful, I guess you could call them micro projects on the ground in Afghanistan that have trained and employed women and men in some very basic ways, including women in the law and so forth. So there are some great best practices out there, and I'd love to tell you about them. And also, in terms of why education of boys, we get lost in this gender. That's another word that sometimes is misleading. We're talking about boys and girls, women and men, and we should be specific about it. Some things can be targeted to one group or another, and some they can work and learn together. I think the impact of that is just exactly what Makia said about her father. She said, I am here today because of my father. And she is one of the scholarship students through IEAW. She's a senior at Montclair University this year, and her aspiration is to be either the first female Minister of Foreign Affairs or perhaps a president of Afghanistan. So that's the future. That's the future. And my favorite proverb in Dari is Katra Katra Darya Meshawad. Drop by drop, a river is made. And there are lots of people here who are making a torrent for Afghanistan. Thank you.
So on to the jobs question, I couldn't agree more that it's one of the absolutely critical pillars for the future. And from what I've observed, when men have been persuaded, including in very rural areas, to let the women in their household work, is when they can be convinced, the economic logic, if they can double their household income, then problems dissolve. And so I think there are conversations that can be had, but it's also about expanding the size of the pie. So as the aid dollars go down, which they will, there's so much untapped economic potential in the country, not without its challenges. You know, is there going to be a natural resource curse? Probably. How does Afghanistan overcome it? Minerals won't provide that many jobs, but it'll certainly provide revenue, which can then invest in the other sectors. And it's the health services, it's the education services, manufacturing, it's, you know, the botanical riches of the country, construction, the whole number of sectors. And we need to move towards that economic analysis rather than asking the question, how do we spend aid dollars? It's for Afghans to ask the question, how are we going to build the economy to sustain the revenue? And that's where I think the conversation needs to change. Then I'll just close with some reflections on a couple of the questions relating to the dialogue, and I think the communication within the country. The quest to have conversations like this inside the country, I think seems to be a glaring need, and there are several people now inside the country talking about the need for a national dialogue. Not a national dialogue on how to cut the country between the 4% and the 1% of minorities, but really about where does the 95% want the country to go, what's their vision for the future. So investing in those kind of spaces for conversation seems to be really critical. And then, as you say, part of that is the regional dialogue, and again, not necessarily a regional dialogue about how to cut the country in some kind of grand bargain, which, as Jim said, may not or probably won't happen, but how do women and men of the region understand the changes that have taken place? There was actually a delegation that came from Pakistan to Afghanistan a few months ago, and the people on that delegation, they came to see these community programs, their sister community programs, and they hadn't visited each other in 10 years. And the message that the Pakistani delegation said that they wanted to take back to the leadership, they said, we're really angry. They said, because we were told that Afghanistan was ungovernable and a wreck and a hopeless case. But what we've seen is Afghanistan has changed. Afghanistan can manage itself, and we need to take that message back to Pakistan. So those kind of dialogues and exchanges, I think, tremendously important.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to touch on the communications point, and what we say here needs to be heard in Afghanistan, which I think is critically important. And the issue back to words, and words have meanings. It's actually one reason why I don't like the word transition or intiqal, because I lived in Pakistan too long, and intiqal means death, or the transition from life to death. And I don't think that's quite the image. Now, it does have a different meaning in Dari, but that said, words do have meanings. And I think this is where there is a gap between, you talk to people in government here and they say we are saying, for example, on the elections, we are saying the right things about the election. And, President Obama, when he met with President Karzai in Washington, the right words were said about it. But often we're very diplomatic in our language, and we think we're saying a lot, and Afghans aren't hearing it in terms of confidence building in the future, and in particular right now in terms of whether we think the elections are going to happen. I think a lot of Afghans don't believe it is a priority for the U.S. And I think we're often a little bit now, I think, too delicate on this issue. I think there's this belief we don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of Afghanistan. Well, we sent 100,000 troops to Afghanistan. To me, that's interfering in their internal affairs. But that was fine, Or economically, we throw lots of money at Afghanistan and are, funding a very, very significant percentage of the economy. That's interfering, but that was okay. But when it comes to the politics, we're all very polite. And yeah, if you don't get the politics right, you can't get the security piece right or the economic piece right. And I think, and really that's where we need to be focusing, and in a way becoming a little bit less diplomatic. And this isn't to say we want to be interfering and picking our favorite individuals to become the next president. I mean, I'll vote for you, but I don't think we should, announce our support for you quite yet. But I think, interfering and supporting the process of democratic elections in Afghanistan is something the U.S. government should do. That's not interfering in a negative sense. So I think that's where we need to be much more forceful in how we communicate, so Afghans actually start hearing it and believing that we mean it. So I think I wanted to make that point. And then finally, I just think today's session was good and fantastic in terms of actually illustrating very tangibly, the gains that have been made. Because certainly when I was running Save the Children's programs and visiting those schools and the village refugee camps and villages of then NWFP or Baluchistan, I have to say I did not have confidence that I would bump into people like that at a gathering at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. So I think this is, again, a sign of the gains we have made, and we need to really work collectively to ensure that we protect those, and not only just protect them, but promote them and move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on Ms. Qureshi's point about the regional perspective. I do spend a lot of time focusing on Pakistan as well. We're here today talking about women in Afghanistan, but frankly, when it comes to Islamist extremist ideologies and their strengthening, Pakistan faces very similar issues. And you just look back to what happened in the Swat Valley in 2009. I remember the famous video that circulated of the young Pakistani girl being whipped by the Pakistani Taliban, which contributed to, I think, waking the Pakistani population up to what was happening in this region. And it was sort of a turning point in that situation. But that could have been Afghanistan. I mean, the problems are very similar in that respect. And it's in Pakistan's interest not to allow this ideology to flourish on either side of the border, because frankly, you have the blowback effect. So again, we have to hold out some hope that Pakistan and Afghanistan will begin to see that facilitating some kind of peace process is in both of their interests. I point to an article, I think it was in the New York Times, by Ahmed Rashid, the Pakistani author today, who basically said there's a new opportunity. We have fresh leadership in Pakistan, a new Pakistani prime minister, even though it's his third time being prime minister in Pakistan. He's relatively new. But, there is an opportunity here to create a new equation between the two countries, overcome some of this bad blood. And if you look at the issue of women and how that relates to this extremist ideology that flourishes on both sides of the border, maybe there is an opportunity for some common ground and common discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. And I promised Hosai one last comment you wanted to add.
There was actually a question in terms of, how can we differentiate between the girls getting educated and literate and those who are turning to madrasas. We have to be very careful in terms of girls going to madrasas, because I have a friend of mine who is actually functioning and having her little center for women in Kandahar. And coming with the idea of saying that how we would be able to sustain it, God forbid, if Taliban turns out to come, and still having those women to come out of their homes and receive some skills, were actually that, the only idea that we came up with, and for me especially, with my first degree in marketing, was that can we relabel it? And relabeling at that time meant that can we just call this one, at the time when we are in the worst case scenario, to say that it's more of a religious place and teaching for Quran, so that still we will be able to have access to women and having women actually coming and utilizing services. But I think what we can do is on the other side of the story would be that, yes, what's really happening in those madrasas would be to look into their curricula. Yes, it's a place where religious studies should be the main focus, but can we actually go out and have the experience of Indonesia, where they have, yes, madrasas and religious schools, but how they could very successfully integrate issues of sciences, social sciences, sciences and other topics in the madrasa curricula. And I can give you an example of one of the madrasas in Mazar, where actually we have started working, in terms of integrating issues of reproductive health for young boys in those madrasas. So those could be, one of the entry points of working with those madrasas to ensure that even if they're not coming and getting formal education, but those topics and main issues are integrated in their curricula.
I want to suggest here today, remember this is part one, so this is the beginning of our conversation. And I'm going to make a commitment today that the title of our next conversation will begin in some kind of relabeling, Afghanistan's New Day. We're not going to focus on the American side, the 2014 withdrawal, but truly Afghanistan's New Day, building confidence, continuing a strong relationship with the international community, and supporting efforts moving forward. I've had the privilege of moderating this phenomenal group of experts. I've had a tear, I've had a laugh, I've learned a lot. I hope it has been useful for all of you, and I hope you'll join me in thanking all of these panelists today.